Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to be painting a hummingbird. These are the materials I will be using in today's lesson. There is a list in the video description, so feel free to pause the video and gather your supplies. It's all pretty standard for myself. Also in the video description is a line drawing that you can print out at the size you plan on doing your painting. Once you've printed it out, you can take a number 2 pencil, apply graphite to the back of your line drawing, and you can position it directly on top of your watercolor paper. Once you have it in place, just trace the entire line drawing with a ballpoint pen, and because of the pressure of your pen, it's going to push that graphite onto your watercolor paper. Go ahead and pause the video while you do your line drawing, and then we will jump in and begin painting. Once you have your bird drawn out on your watercolor paper, you may have some smudges that are a result of resting your hand or fingers during the drawing or transfer. So I like to use a kneaded eraser just to pick up some of those smudges and to clean things up before I begin painting. Once you've cleaned up all the smudges, then it's really important to just take a moment to think about the values you plan on using in your paint colors. How dark are the colors in some areas, and how light are they in others? If you have any areas where you want really light colors, I recommend you take the kneaded eraser and just press down with firm pressure and tap along any dark pencil lines so that you can lighten those up, and that way they're less likely to show up in your finished painting. If during that process there's a couple lines where you would feel more comfortable having them a little bit more visible before you begin, you can just take a pencil and do a quick little drawing just so you don't lose sight of some of those critical elements, such as the beak or eye, or maybe even some of the details on the feet. So just take a moment to kind of pause and make sure you have everything you need before you begin painting. I like to make sure I have, 2 front claws going over the front, and then at least a single claw in the back for the feet. So before I get too far forward, I just like to make sure I at least have those essentials so it visually makes sense. I'm not so much worried about the branch that the hummingbird is sitting on, because that's going to be quite a few dark values. Once you have everything drawn out and you're happy with the values of your pencil, we can begin mixing paint colors. I will be using a number 10 round to mix my paints. I like to use my large brush to carry as much clean water over to my palette, and I'm going to begin with just a couple light painterly splashes in the background before I begin on the details of the bird. So I've put water in a few different wells, and then one of the first colors I am going to get is a Cerulean Blue. It's kind of a light blue that I plan on using in the background. And at any time I think I have my colors at the value I would like, I always test it out just to make sure the color will be as vibrant as I need. The next color I'm going to use is more of a lemon yellow. It's the most vibrant yellow I have, and it mixes really nicely with the cerulean blue. And then the third color I am going to make is actually between those two. So I'm going to add some of the lemon yellow to my palette. And then I'm going to be adding the smallest amount of that cerulean blue to make kind of this lime green color. And anytime I think I'm close, I always test out my color before I go to my painting. Once I'm happy with my background colors and their values, so then I'm going to begin applying clean water. With this clean water, I want to avoid the bird as well as the little blossoms that are on the branch. So I'm going to be taking my time as I apply clean water. If you would prefer, you could always put masking fluid around the outer edges of your bird and the blossoms, but I'm not so much worried about the twig or branch that the bird is sitting on. If my water hits that branch, it's okay, because the color I'm using in the background is so light that it's really not going to be a negative impact on my painting. So I'm just taking my time, adding my clean water. And you'll notice that I'm being relatively heavy-handed because I want this water to stay damp long enough for me to kind of get in the effects that I plan on doing. So after I have some clean water down, I'm going to dry my brush by dabbing my sponge, and I'm going to tap any really thick puddles of water using my dry brush just to even things out. This is going to give me better control of where my paint colors will go. The only reason I had heavy water was just to ensure things stayed wet long enough for me to wet the whole area that I wanted on this side of the bird. Now that I've evened out the water, and I'm going to tip my paper so you can kind of see where I've applied it. Now I'm going to get some of that lemon yellow, and I'm going to add this color to the background on the right side. But I'm not going to extend this color all the way to the outer edge because I want a little bit of a more painterly, loose effect. Now this is about as far as I am going to take the paint at this moment. And then from here on, I'm just going to be a little bit more random and just create some texture that slowly disperses and becomes less before I reach the outside edge. So I'm just coming in and kind of adding some texture so this background is a little bit more dispersed. If I feel like any of the color might be too vibrant, I can actually just rinse my brush and use just a clean, wet brush to kind of drag and pull the color out so it's a little softer towards the outer edges. Anytime I have real thick puddling of paint, I just dry my brush off on my sponge and I soak up that excess puddling. And then if I want to go one step further, I can create a couple splashes. So I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to dip it in that lime green color, and I'm going to grab a second brush as something to bang against. So I have this brush fully loaded with my lime green, and I'm going to position my brush over top of where I want the splatter, and I'm just going to pop it down on top of that wet surface. I can do the same thing with my yellow. I can rinse my brush of the green, get the water out of my brush, and I can load my brush with that yellow. And I can just get a few fun little splatters on the background. Anything that has accidentally come in contact with my bird, since these colors are pretty much non-staining, I can clean my brush and dry it, and I can just pick up some of these colors. And if there's a little tint left behind, I'm not going to stress about it because I know the colors I plan on using in these areas of my bird are going to be quite dark. So now that I've kind of absorbed the splatters that hit my bird, I'm going to move on to adding clean water to the left side of my bird. Now I don't want to go too far with the water. If I accidentally got into my bird, just tear off a piece of dry, clean paper towel and press down with firm pressure in the area where water accidentally went inside your hummingbird. That way you can dry that off before you begin adding paint. So I'm going to tip my paper so you can kind of see where I applied that water. So I didn't go real far to the left. I didn't go the full length of the bird, and I didn't even bring it all the way up to the top because I want a loose painterly edge. Now that I have my water down, I'm going to grab some of that Cerulean Blue. And while I have some of this Cerulean Blue on my brush, I'm going to return to the right side where I have some of my wet background yet, and I'm just going to tap some of these blues over into the background on this side. I think it's always important to kind of have some of your colors that are from the left behind your subject pop out over on the right. That way things look cohesive. I'm just using a dry brush to kind of control how much paint is down, and I'm soaking up any puddling just so it's easier to control. Now I'm going to return to the left side of my bird, and I'm soaking up some of the excess puddling of the color. Now, just like I did on the right side, having a pop of blue, it's important to have just a small pop of yellow on the left side. So I'm just going to introduce some yellow to this left edge. And I can kind of create a textured painterly background by just tapping my brush and trying to be focused on the shapes. I'm just using a clean brush with just a little bit of water to kind of pull some of that color out here and there. And if I want, and I can add some splatters to this side. So I'm going to grab some of my blue, just banging it against a brush. If any of them hit the inside of my bird, I can simply clean my brush and take that clean brush into those areas to soak up that paint before it dries. If there's any little splatters that I feel like might be too much, I can just use a dry paper towel and soak up some of their color. I'm going to grab some of that lime green and just introduce a few bits of lime green to my background on this side. And I need to get out before things begin drying, so I'm just soaking up any puddling of paint just so things dry faster and more even. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now I'm going to hit this with a blow dryer so I can begin painting the bird. If you got any of your background colors into the area of your hummingbird, you can simply erase those colors using a relatively stiff square brush. Just get the brush wet with clean water. Make sure there's no droplets hanging out on the metal portion of your brush. And then take your stiff square brush into the area that you want to erase and just go back and forth with the water on your brush, and it will begin to lift the paint from your paper. When you see the paint starting to move, you can take a clean paper towel and just dab with firm pressure to lift that paint up. So you can do this anywhere on your painting. If you feel like you have color in your blossoms that you don't want from the splatters, you can take a moment to lift those. Same within your branch, if you felt like it was really necessary. Okay. So now I'm going to begin mixing up the colors I plan on using for the blossoms and my bird. Now I have a few colors on my palette already that I could use, but I need to add to them. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get more blue in my mixture. I don't need a lot of paint. I just rather have a darker, more vibrant blue for what I intend to use for my hummingbird. And to make it get a little bit more teal, I'm going to add a little bit of Viridian Hue to it, just enough to make it this beautiful teal color. Once I have that color made up, the next color I'm going to mix is going to be vibrant pink. So I'm going to take some water over to a new area of my palette, and I'm going to get this permanent rose color. And I want this to be nice and vibrant. And if anytime I am questioning whether or not the value is what I want, I just test it out on a scrap piece of paper. I'm also going to get more yellow. So I'm just adding some water and grabbing more of that lemon yellow, but I want this lemon yellow to be very vibrant. So I'm grabbing more pigment to add to it. I also want to mix up some neutral colors. So something for the branch as well as some of the belly feathers of my bird. So I'm going to get some water, put it in a new well, and I'm going to grab the smallest amount of Payne's gray so I can create just a real soft gray color. I don't want this color to be too dark. And I'm going to add just a little bit of the Cerulean and permanent pink or permanent rose, just to give it a subtle purple tint. I like having some purples into my grays. And then I'm going to have one gray mixture that is just without the purple. And I'm just moving slowly with my values, taking the time to make sure they are what I want before I begin painting. And then for my branch color, I'm going to go ahead and use some burnt umber. And I want this burnt umber to be on the darker side. So I'm taking enough time to grab extra pigment into that mixture so it's not watered down. Once I feel like I'm close, I just test out my color and make sure it is what I would like. Okay. So now that I have my colors mixed up the way I'd like, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush so I can begin adding just a little bit of color to the blossoms. If I'm concerned about any of the pencil lines, I just tap my brush to lighten them up before I bring in my paint color. I'm going to just start with the outer blossom here. I'm just adding a little bit of water. And it can be hard to see where your water is, so sometimes it's nice to like tint your color before you bring it in, with just a very tiny bit of paint. Really up to you. So for this blossom, I just want to kind of get a base color. I'm not worried about any definition of the petals or anything like that. I want it to be a little looser. So I'm just kind of tapping some pink into where I have some of the water. And then I'm going to go a step further, grab a little bit of that lemon yellow, And I am just going to add a small touch here and there, just so there is some variety in the color and values of this blossom. It'll just kind of give an interesting base to paint on. And I'm making sure not to go too dark. You always want to slowly work towards your darks. You don't want to get dark right off the bat, otherwise you'll lose depth later. So I'm just starting with a real soft value with just a couple touches of some darks for interest, and I'm going to let that be and dry. I'm going to move on to the next blossom and do the same thing. So I'm just using my number 6 round to come in with a small amount of water. If I have a huge puddle of water, I try to soak that up before I bring in my paint. That will allow me to control where my paint goes a little better. I'm going to grab a little bit of that pink. Notice how I'm always wiping my brush off on the rim of my palette before I bring my paint color over. I'm doing that so I can remove some of the excess paint, so my brush is only semi-loaded with the paint color. A semi-loaded brush will help ensure that your paint doesn't completely dominate the entire shape of your subject. I only want to bring over a small amount of paint, not a huge amount. I rinsed my brush and dried it off on my sponge before dipping in my lemon yellow. And I'm now going to return to my blossom, and just at the end of my blossom, I'm going to add just a small touch of yellow. And I always want there to be at least a little hint of some lighter colors. So I take a moment to use a dry brush to kind of push the color around and make sure things don't get too dark. And then I'll move on to the next blossom. I'm going to get just a small amount of water. Making sure there's not thick puddles of water, so I make sure to dry some of that excess water up off the page. I'm going to grab a little bit of my pink and just repeat the same process. I can then grab a little bit of my lemon yellow, remembering to wipe my brush off on the rim. And I can return to this blossom and just add a touch of yellow near my light source. If I feel like everything's kind of the same value, I'll soak up some of that paint using a clean, dry brush and just applying some pressure so my brush soaks up that excess. Going to my last blossom. I don't want too much water, so I'm soaking up that water and then adding my paint. If I feel like there's too much paint, I can just use a dry brush to soak some of that excess paint up and get it back under control. I'll add just a little bit of yellow here and there in the blossom. Now I'm going to use my number 6 round to just add some clean water throughout my hummingbird. I'm going to try to stay within the bird itself without touching my background. So just take your time when you're up against those edges. When I get to the very bottom of my hummingbird, I'm making sure that the water has some texture to it so it reads like feathers once I introduce color. I don't mind color hitting the beak, so I'm going to go right over top of it. Once I have everything really saturated with water, I'm going to tip my paper so you can see how wet that is. I do want to make sure there's no puddling of water because that will make it very hard for me to control where my paint colors go. So along the back of the bird, I kind of want to give this glowing effect. So I'm going to use that lemon yellow all across the back. I can bring some of that down into the tail as well. And even up against the back of the head. And I also want this glow to kind of affect the neck and belly of the bird. So on the right side, I'm taking that lemon yellow right up against the edge. Once I have the yellow in place, I'm going to add just a little bit below on the feathers there. Once I have that yellow in place, I just still make sure there's no puddling. If there's any areas where my hummingbird is already beginning to dry, such as the tail I noticed on mine specifically is already drying, I just add a little bit of water before I start bringing in my color. Just extends my working time. I'm going to grab some of that vibrant pink for the head. I don't mind if it ends up hitting the beak or the eye. And I'm going to bring that color pretty close to the top. Bring a little bit of it back behind the eye. I'm going to bring some of that color down into the neck. Now, if I feel like some of that pink is creeping into the areas that I would like to maintain yellow, I just rinse my brush and dry it on a sponge, and I use that dry brush to help soak up the paint that is creeping into areas where I don't want it. So a dry, clean brush is a great way to kind of control your paint and to keep them in the zones that you would like them. But try to also embrace letting watercolors do their thing, because that's when happy accidents show up. Too much control and it takes all the fun away from it. So I'm just going to make sure I have a really nice, vibrant color through the center of my head. I'm now going to take the really soft gray, and I don't want it everywhere. And notice how I'm kind of keeping my distance from the yellows, because I know gray and yellow don't always mix to make the prettiest colors. So I'm just kind of giving my yellows some space. I'm just tapping in some grays. Notice I'm dotting in my grays. I'm not being real heavy-handed, and I'm letting there be some white in between for texture. Now I'm going to rinse my brush, and I'm going to grab some of the gray that I added the purple to. But I'm always wiping my brush off so it's not overloaded with color. So near the bottom of my bird, I want more shadow. So I'm tapping in some of these purple grays at the bottom of the belly, especially near the feet. And I can kind of drag that pink color out onto the dry paper, so it kind of gives the illusion of some fluff. Just to resaturate things, I'm going to continue to use this gray purple to kind of resaturate some parts of the tail that are already beginning to dry. And before things begin drying too much, I want to tap in some other fun colors into that wing. So I want to get kind of a lime green again. I want it to be vibrant. I'm just going to add some sap green. And I'm just going to take some of these greens and just tap them in without letting them completely cover up all my yellows. Now, green and pink are just going to make different variations of brown, so I'm keeping those two colors distant from each other. I'm now going to grab that beautiful teal color, making sure to wipe off the excess. And I'm just tapping my brush where I think it might be nice to have some feathers of that color. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. While things are still shiny, I have the option to come in with any colors and continue to play. Right now I'm just grabbing some lemon yellow and tapping them along the neckline to push some of those pinks back, just to maintain some of that brightness. It's also kind of fun to intentionally make little blooms to create texture. Before I let things dry, I always like to kind of trace the edge with a very minimal part of my brush just to clean things up before I let things dry completely. It also ensures that I can kind of cover up some of the little pockets of white from the paper that maybe my first pass didn't quite cover. I don't want the back wing to darken up too much, so I'm just tapping in a little bit of yellows to brighten things up before I hit this with the blow dryer. I'm also going to take some of this yellow along with the pink. I'm going to make an orange. And just real minimally, a touch here and there on the back wing. And now I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer, just layer one. Now that things are completely dry, I can slowly start to just build texture. It's easy to get overwhelmed with the texture of feathers, but if you just kind of pause, don't think you need to draw every feather, and just add some color here and there, it kind of simplifies the process and becomes really fun, but it does take practice just like anything else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my pink, and I'm using a small brush, and I'm just going to go across some areas where I want the feathers to be a little darker. And I'm just doing little lines to create texture. I'm going to use some of this pink on the back of the eye just to darken things up a little bit. But notice the amount of negative space I'm leaving between my paint strokes. And notice that my strokes aren't all even and perfect. I'm allowing there to be some texture. There's nothing wrong with your hummingbird looking fuzzy. I'm continuing with some of this texture throughout my pinks. And I like to keep some of the texture minimal, so there's some areas where there's no texture at all. I feel like it just kind of gives the eyes a place to take a break. If we're too heavy-handed with the texture, it can be a little overwhelming to look at. I'm just going back over some areas where maybe some of my texture, once it was dried, it was a little more subtle than I would prefer. So just doing a second layer selectively in a couple areas will help bring some of that out. Once I have my pinks down, I can do the same thing with the feathers across the back. I can just keep it random. Try not to overdo the detail. And I'm just angling the feathers down towards the tail. After my green has dried, I can add some of the teals. As long as I don't see any thick standing puddles of paint, my teals should already be dry, which will allow me to come in and add some of this vibrant color. Sometimes I'll just create dashed lines that kind of go in a circle or a semicircle just to create the illusion of textures or feathers without actually having to draw or paint each feather. When I get to the tail, I can just add a couple longer lines for interest. And any teal that isn't quite as dark as I would like it to be on that first pass, I can just add a second layer. Notice how I'm not completely covering up everything with my texture. I'm letting those little subtle pops of white and green show through so it's not too heavy-handed. Now, if you overlay this teal on a pink, it makes kind of this purple color. And it's a great way to create shadows on the head of the hummingbird where you have a lot of the pink feathers. So I'm just going to come in to the front portion of my hummingbird's eye. I just want to kind of create some shadows in this area. I want to go on the underside of the eye as well. And I can carry some of these feathers across to the back behind the eye. I also want to add a little bit of shadow underneath the beak. So I'm just bringing in some of that teal on top of the pinks below the beak area. If there's any areas within the pinks that you want to add some of those shadows, just throw in a little bit of that teal. Just keep it subtle. Now I'm going to grab some of that gray purple mixture that I made up. And I'm just going to add some fuzz to the belly. And it's always okay to just leave some of those areas without any texture. It's easy to just go on autopilot and be a little heavy-handed. The area where I do want to be heavy-handed is where the feathers are in shadow at the bottom near the feet. So I'm not being heavy-handed enough to completely fill the entire thing in, but I'm definitely adding a heavier amount of texture to darken up the value. Trying to be mindful of where I want to be light with my texture. I'm going to use a little bit of the orange to create some texture closer to my light source on the belly. So in the areas where I have yellows, just using the orange to kind of create that texture there. I'm now going to get some of that cerulean blue by itself. And I know this is going to seem weird, but I often paint the entire eye of an animal blue first, and then after the blue completely dries, I come back in with a real rich black to kind of darken things up. But I'll leave a little bit of the blue behind so it looks like a highlight in the eye. Notice how I try to maintain a thin area untouched by the dark colors going around. And that's because typically hummingbirds' eyes, many birds' eyes actually, have a small circle of scales that go around their eye, separating it from the feathers. So that's why I tried to maintain a ring there. I'm going to allow the feathers and texture to have some time to dry, and I'm going to move on to the blossoms. I don't want to be too heavy-handed, and I don't want to be too literal. I don't need to paint every single texture and blossom, so I'm just coming in and doing a stroke here, a stroke there, to imply that there might be different petals to the blossom without actually feeling the need to define every single one. A lot of times I find that doing little V's is helpful. And I can always come in with a damp brush and kind of push and pull that shadow color around so it has the chance to kind of blend in with the rest of the blossom, so it looks a little bit more deliberate. rinsed my brush so I can kind of push and pull some of these colors around. I'm just using a dry brush to kind of soak up any puddling of the texture that I just created on the blossom. And then I just use a clean, barely damp brush to kind of push and pull some edges. Now I'm going to use a number 6 round to wet the tail of my hummingbird, which has had chance to dry. And I'm going to bring a little bit of that water into the side wing, but I'm not going to bring it too far to the left edge. And it's okay if these two sections of water run into each other. I'm going to make sure there's no puddles, and I'm going to tip my paper so you can kind of see where that water is. Now I'm going to grab some of the brown that I made up for the branch to use in my hummingbird. So I want some of this brown to be for the back wing. When I get close to the bottom portion of my bird, I want to make sure the edge is textured, so it kind of reads like there's some overlaying feathers there. I'm just bringing some of this brown in for the forward wing. As I get closer to the side, I can be a little bit more selective with where I want the brown, adding some texture so it looks like there's some overlapping feathers on top. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. While that area is drying, I'm going to return to the branch and paint it brown. Now, what's kind of fun about this branch is I'm going to do the top portion near the light source to include a little bit more oranges. So before I begin, I should mix up a good orange first. So I'm using that lemon yellow with that permanent rose pink to make like a really fun orange. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in towards the top portion of the branch with this orange. I'm going to soak up some of the puddling. And then before I go too far, I'm going to grab a little bit of the brown to go along the bottom edge, just to kind of push the darks a little bit. Now that I have that section done, I'm going to not mess with it. I'm going to re-rinse my brush, grab some orange again, and go to the next portion. It's okay to have part of the branch kind of coming up and meeting with the blossom. I soak up the excess paint before I grab my browns. When I get my browns on my brush, I make sure to wipe away the excess paint so it's not overloaded. And I'm just tracing that bottom edge of the branch until it comes in contact. Now notice how I am okay with there being some blooms and textures between the two colors. That's just going to lend itself to the texture of the branch, so I'm not worried about it. I'm going to grab more of that orange and just move on slowly through each section of the branch. I want to soak up any puddling of paint before I bring in my browns. And I always remember to wipe the excess paint off my brush. The bird's feet are so dark in value that I am okay with going over top of them with my branch colors. I'm just trying to be mindful of some of the feather details that I've established in this area and trying to go around them to the best of my ability. I'm going to soak up any puddling. Grab some of my browns, make sure my brush doesn't have too much paint. And I'm just going to let that dry. So any texture that came of that technique is only going to help the texture of the branch. So I'm not worried about it. While the branch is drying, I'm going to take a moment to darken up some of the shadows in the blossom. So I can make a purple using the teal and pink. And with this purple, I can go into just a few parts of the blossom just to give it a little bit more dimension. And I'm not blending these ones out. I'm just making sure it's small, it's sparing. All right, I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer because the next detail I need to do is related to the wing. Now I'm going to get some of the burnt umber and I'm going to pull it apart or pull some of it over into a new well. I'm going to add some Payne's gray to it so it's darker. And I'm going to even add a little bit of pink to the mixture just to warm it up a bit. Once I have a nice dark color, I'm going to add some details to this front wing. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to establish the front edge of this wing. And I want to be okay with having that texture and not feeling the need to kind of make sense of every single line and feather. Now I'm going to use some of that color to darken up the entire back wing that is in shadow. While that area is drying, I can take some of this dark color that I've mixed up for the wing, and I can add a touch of it on the underside of some of my blossoms and to create some additional texture on the branch. I don't want these blossoms to kind of fade into the background, so I really want some good contrast. And if I want, I can continue with some of this dark color on the underside of the branch. I'm just deliberately making it rough so it doesn't look so perfect. I want to give it some texture. So don't even it out. Don't remove all the texture and smooth it out. Do some tapping with your brush for dots and little dashes. Now, right now, the back of my bird is very similar in value to the background. So to darken that up a bit, I'm going to get some more of that cerulean blue. And I just want to give more contrast between the background and my bird. So I'm coming in with a dark mixture of that cerulean blue. And I'm now going to rinse my brush. I'm going to use just a brush with clean water on it to kind of smear this color. If I want, I can even come in and selectively paint a couple little dots. Just soaking up some of the excess puddling so it dries a little faster. I'm going to add a little bit more of the greens to the background in front on the right side of my bird. Again, it's just all about contrast, trying to make that bird be the focal point and make it pop forward. So I'm always looking at the contrast of anything I paint. I can just use a brush with clean water. And I want a little bit of that green to pop out on the opposite side of the stick or branch. All right, while those background areas are dry, this wing has since dried, so I'm going to get a darker Payne's Gray. And I'm going to darken up just the edge of that wing a little bit. I can also bring some of this color into that back wing. However, I want that shadow to kind of blend in so it looks intentional. So I'm just using a damp brush to kind of pull that color out and blend it with the rest of the browns that I used back there. I can also use some of this darker Payne's Gray sparingly to kind of push the darks of some of the feathers on the underside of my hummingbird. I can also use this Payne's Gray to just selectively darken up a few areas of the feathers on the back wing. I'm now going to use that grayed out purple to just give a little bit of color to the beak. This will just be the first layer on the beak. If you accidentally went too wide, just dab with a paper towel, give it some time to dry, and then come back and add your color again. I'm going to switch to my smallest brush and add some dark blacks to the eye of the hummingbird. I'm going to leave a portion of the eye, the blue, so it looks like a reflection. And then for the scales around the eye, I can just try and tap some really small dotted textures. I can use some of that Payne's gray if I need to push some of the darks in a few feathers. I'm going to get more of that permanent rose with a little bit of teal, so it's more of a really dark kind of burgundy color. And in just a few areas of the head feathers where I feel like maybe the pinks are not quite as dark as we'd like, I can just add another layer. But again, I'm resisting the urge to paint every single feather. Just imply the texture. You don't need to paint every single feather. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to get more of that teal color and push some of my teals to be just a little darker. It's all about that contrast for me. I'm going to give a second attempt at the beak with that gray purple, using a small brush, try not to go too wide. I think my background wasn't completely dry enough, so I wasn't getting the definition on the beak that I wanted. I'm going to hit the beak with the blow dryer so I can push the darks in a few areas. Down at the bottom, I noticed that the light feathers are kind of camouflaged into the background. So before I forget, I am just going to put a little bit of Cerulean Blue on the underside. I feel like it's going to help kind of brighten up this area. And I always want a little tint of it popping out on the other side. So I'm just using a brush with some clean water. So I think that's going to give it a little better contrast. So now I can return to the beak now that that's completely dry, and I can use the darker Payne's Gray. I want to try and hold my brush as vertical as possible and keep my pressure very light and just go through the center of the beak. I also want to kind of push the contrast on the underside of the beak. And then maybe just the smallest little dot to indicate a nose. That was a little big. I'll just let that be subtle. Darken up some of the feathers that are underneath. If the eye isn't as dark as we want, it never hurts to add another layer of black or Payne's Gray to the eye because it's such an important part. Now I want to add some feet to my bird. I'm going to use some Payne's Gray. And I don't want to put too many details into these feet. So I rather they are slimmer than I need than to make them real big and bulky. So I just kind of did like a little hook for the front claw of the foot, and I can come back with an eraser to try and erase some of these pencil marks. And then I'm going to create a second hook just behind that. And be okay with the feet being imperfect. The more you play with them, the bigger they get, and it just makes it more obvious. I need to push some of the darks in the beak yet, and then I can move on to adding some of my bright white highlights as a finishing touch. I'm just using a damp brush to kind of push some of that pigment around for the lower half of the beak. So now we're going to really brighten things up by adding some opaque white. So this is the white I plan on using. You can use a white gouache. It just may not be as bright. Just make sure you don't water it down too much. So I'm just taking my wet brush right into this paint. Making sure there's no droplets on my little metal portion of the brush. And I'm going to come in here. Let me see a drop of water. And I want to brighten up the right side by kind of adding a white highlight near my light source. I'm also going to use some of this white on the right side just to add some light reflecting on some of the feathers. I do want a little bit of light kind of reflecting off the top of the beak. I'm going to continue down the right side, making sure that when I add these white, I'm doing so in a way that kind of reads like feathers. I'm okay with things looking fluffy. I can add a small amount of white to the eye if I'd like for a reflection. And now I'm going to go across the back of the bird using feather-like texture to add a highlight on the back side as well. I'm continuing with this white across the back. And some of these whites can kind of trickle into the feathers of the wing. Going to add some of the whites to the bottom of the bird if it didn't quite turn out as fuzzy as you would prefer. And then I like the idea of adding a little bit to the top of the branch so it kind of looks like it's glowing in the same sunlight. I want to make sure to not overload my brush too much or my white will be too thick and my line work will be too wide. I also want to add a little bit of this white kind of reflection on parts of the flower. So I can have some parts on the little petals. Doesn't have to be on every single one. Making sure to wipe the excess off my brush so it's not too much. Just adding a few highlights to those petal ends so they look bright. If there's anything about the feet that you're not a super big fan of, you can use the white to kind of cover up or thin out. So I'm just going to make a couple areas of some of these pink blossoms a little bit more vibrant. Particularly on the back side away from the light source. And I'm going to do one more pass of white over the back of my bird just to brighten it up a bit. Sometimes it takes a couple coats to get the brightness you want. And then maybe just a few select whites on the belly feathers. But otherwise, I feel like this little hummingbird is done. I hope you learned a lot by painting with me today and working on this hummingbird. If you do paint it, I would absolutely love to see your finished birds. Just send me an email or message me through social media, which is also in the description of this video. And if you like it, give me a thumbs up. Share the video, spread the word. I'm just trying to share my knowledge, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.